Hey guys, and welcome to my channel, Time is But a Window. Now in this video, I'm going to be talking about how to optimize and get the lowest possible input latency in Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Now for those of you who have no idea what input latency or input lag is, it's the amount of time to describe the latency between pressing an input and seeing it on the screen. Now input latency isn't the only type of latency involved, but it can give you a slight advantage, a slight edge of being able to see your opponent and react to your opponent quicker. Now sadly, when it comes to showing you guys the results, I do not know how to graph this stuff, and I don't know how to maintain overall averages. So we will be basing these results off the minimum and maximum latencies. But before we get into everything else, let's start off with launch options. Now to access your launch options, you just have to right click on Counter-Strike Global Offensive in Steam and go to Properties. On the bottom, you'll see the section for launch options. Now there are a ridiculous amount of launch options out there, but I still tried to test as many of them as I could find. Now for all of these tests, I used no vid and 360 Hz, and that is because I use a 360 Hz monitor to test latencies. Now I should mention that all of these tests are from one computer, so it is possible that these results could change from computer to computer. Now the PC that I tested these settings on was an RTX 2080 Ti with an i9-9900K. And given the architecture of the 30 series, you probably will get lower latencies with those cards. But since I don't have one, it's not something I can test. If anyone out there has a 3090, feel free to send it to my PO box. Alright, so now to go over the results. With no launch options, you had the most stable input latency. That means the least latency variable from low latency to high latency. Alright, so there is really only one setting I advise you don't use, and that setting is dash threads. By itself, dash threads was increasing the minimum and maximum latency by 2 milliseconds. Now this is supposed to optimize the game to use all of your CPU threads, but for whatever reason it seems to add quite a bit of latency. Now if you want to get the absolute lowest latency possible, you can use dash high. This will make the game run in high priority, but from what I found, it feels like it messes with the mouse input a little bit. And while it did lower the minimum possible latency, it did increase the maximum latency. But overall, you could definitely notice that it made the game feel a little bit more unstable. So here are the settings if you want the absolute lowest latency possible. But keep in mind, this makes things incredibly inconsistent, and I was getting some pretty big spikes up to 25 milliseconds in latency, as well as the occasional random crash. However, these are the settings if you want the most consistent experience. Now personally, I don't even like these settings. In fact, the settings I prefer to play with, I would take away high priority and add process heap. And this is because even though high priority does seem to lower your input latency quite a bit, the mouse input starts to feel really weird on it. But while process heap does make the game a little bit less stable and might make it crash sometimes, it does lower the amount of input latency you have by about 500 microseconds, which is about half of 1 millisecond. Now I could go on and on about launch options, but I really want this video to cover a broad spectrum of things. So next, let's talk about Windows Game Mode. Turning on Windows Game Mode increases input latency by 300 microseconds. It's not much, but you might as well not use this mode. Next up, let's talk about Mat Q Mode. Now Mat Q Mode is a setting you can set in your AutoEXE or in your launch options. Now if you set Mat Q Mode to -1, it should make it so that it finds the automatic best settings for your computer. -2 is Legacy Multi-Core Rendering, and setting it to 2 is Standard Multi-Core Rendering. In my opinion, it doesn't matter which of these three you use, just use one of those, because you don't want to use 0 or 1, because that is single core rendering, and you can see how much that increases the input latency. Alright, next up, let's talk about the NVIDIA drivers. Now making this video took a really long time, and as you can see at the time, the newest drivers were the 3/19/2021 drivers. Why did this video take so long to make, you ask? Well, because I lost all of my results, and I was not happy about it. And while I did go through the original NVIDIA driver options one by one, the individual settings didn't really change much. So instead of doing that all over again, I thought I'd just show you two options. On the top, you can see the stock drivers right when you install them. Meanwhile, setting everything to performance mode is on the bottom. You actually get a little bit of a performance decrease on the low end. You can see how little anything changes, and it's really almost pointless to even configure your NVIDIA settings. Well, that is, except for the ones I'm about to go over. The frame rate limiter modes. Alright, so there is a program out there called NVIDIA Inspector. This allows you to edit hidden NVIDIA settings. And long story short, this is basically the settings you want right here. Basically, turning the frame rate limiter mode to off lowers your maximum input latency by about 2 milliseconds. Though what I found is in the newest drivers, you can't actually even edit your frame rate limiter mode, so I actually had to roll back to older drivers to do this. Okay, next let's take a look at display scaling and streaming cards. Now when it came to display scaling, really there was only one setting that seemed to stand out from all the others, and that is using display scaling to stretch your screen. For some reason that slightly increased input latency, whereas GPU scaling to stretch the screen didn't. But definitely if you want the absolute lowest latency, you want to turn scaling off. Now the good news is, for all those streamers out there, using a streaming card only increased the latency by about 100 microseconds. Now the streaming card I'm using is an AverMedia HD2. Next up, we have NVIDIA's ultra-low latency mode. Now I had watched a lot of videos about how using ultra-low latency mode would actually make your latency higher. So the results I got were completely unexpected. I don't know if this is just something that's improved over time with drivers or what. Now there are technically two latency mode settings. Now there's one in the regular NVIDIA settings and there's one in the inspector NVIDIA settings. So I tested them all and found that ultra low latency mode on Ultra actually had the lowest delay. Yet setting it to on, which is only 1 frame queued as opposed to off, which is supposed to be up to 3 frames queued, was actually higher delay. So I tried to get used to Ultra for a little bit, but to be completely honest, it feels like it messes with the mouse input too much. So personally, I just settled for the next best and just use it on off. Even though technically you can set the latency mode to 1 in the NVIDIA Inspector and get a little bit of an input latency performance boost. Or at least I think. These numbers are all so close, we're talking microseconds. Which brings us to the next thing, which is G-Sync. And really, no matter how you slice it, you just want to have G-Sync off. It just adds a little bit of input latency. Oh well, so much for not getting any frame tearing. Now one thing I do want to mention is I did most of these results with high priority set to off. I did this because I was getting far more stable results and it was far easier to record. Now there is one more setting that seemed to slightly improve input latency, and that is disable full screen optimizations. And it only really improves your maximum input latency by about 1 millisecond. So I guess the question is, what did I really learn from this entire tedious process? Well, the truth is you can't really optimize CSGO very much. And every time you do try to optimize it, there's a trade-off. And even with everything as optimized as you can possibly get it, it's still nowhere near as optimized as Reflex low latency mode is for Valorant. In that game, you're getting like sub 5 milliseconds of input latency. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but really the Source engine needs a massive overhaul. It's testing like this that really shows its limitations, and the fact that it's incompatible with NVIDIA's Reflex ultra-low latency mode really limits the future of what can be accomplished with it. So yeah, looking back at the launch options, if you really want the lowest possible latency, you need to get rid of threads if you're using it. High priority can lower your input latency, but does make the game have a higher maximum latency. So while I think it'll usually give you a bit of an advantage, I feel like in high stress situations when you got nades and mollies on the ground, it actually gives you a slight disadvantage with higher latency. And don't forget to turn off your frame rate limiter mode. Anyways guys, I hope you guys found this video informative. I'm sorry there isn't more and we couldn't get more out of CSGO with these settings. At the end of the day, it feels like there is actually very little you can do to improve it. Anyways guys, I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, have a great day.